White Sox had some of Major League Baseball's top names on their roster, including first baseman Chick Gandil, pitcher Eddie Seacott, third baseman Buck Weaver, center fielder Oscar Happy Felsch, and of course the star of the show, a wickedly talented left fielder by the name of Joe Jackson. As a new decade fast approached, America was a nation on the make in every industry. Envelopes were being handed under tables in exchange for the odd favour, and professional sports was no exception. Spectators had been putting money on the game since the 1800s, so by the time the 1919 World Series came around, the industry of sports gambling had been thriving for at least half a century. Chicago at that time was a city held up by multiple pillars of corruption. Certain members of the police were bought and paid for, as were politicians, and Chicago residents who had passed away still somehow managed to vote in every election. They played baseball in a time where skullduggery was commonplace, a time when creative methods of cheating were a constant and pretty much an accepted part of the game. For example, pitchers became skilled in such things as making the ball as dirty as they could, in order to make it as difficult as possible for the batter to see. They would do this by rubbing the ball on the ground, and sometimes they would even smear tobacco on it for good measure. Cheating to win was a regular occurrence, but to intentionally lose a game for money was far more rare. Before 1919, the only team ever to be found guilty of a fix were the Louisville Grays way back in 1877. The Grays may have been the only team that got busted, but they probably weren't the only team that was guilty, as there was no shortage of unconfirmed rumours. And one of those rumours that got the White Sox talking about things was what may have happened in the 1918 World Series between the Chicago Cubs and the Boston Red Sox. On top of the rumours that it may have been a fix, what was definitely true is that both sets of players had their World Series bonuses dramatically reduced from the agreed amount. The difference was significant enough that both sets of players threatened to strike before Game 5, unanimously refusing to take the field. So owners across baseball weren't playing fair with the players, which is more than likely what sparked the idea in the first place of beating them at their own game. Chicago White Sox owner Charles Comiskey was known for having short arms and deep pockets, and he paid a lot of players considerably less than what they were worth talent-wise and what they may have received in pay at other teams. Comiskey was an elitist and clearly favoured the most college-educated players, and regardless of talent, often paid them more money. There were certain players on the White Sox that didn't have half of Joe Jackson's talent, but still made 3 times his salary just because they had college educations. A first baseman by the name of Hal Chase embodies the exact type of player I'm talking about when I say that some players didn't practice deception for money alone. Hopefully this clip from the movie Sexy Beast, starring Ray Winston and Ben Kingsley, can help express the spirit that I'm talking about.
You're on 2%, 2.5, maybe even 3. Depends on the usual bum flufferys. It's not about the money, with you and me, is it, girl? It's the charge, it's the bolt, it's the buzz. It's the sheer fuck-offness of it all, am I right?
When it came to sheer fuck-offness, Hal Chase was your man. There was no doubt about it, that's who this guy was. And back then it was difficult to officially prove that payoffs had been made. There's not any digital records of transactions, there's no CCTV that could pick up an envelope being passed around. You know, unless you got a confession or a statement from a reliable witness, there was really no way to prove this kind of stuff. Even so, everybody in baseball knew that Hal Chase was a compulsive gambler, and even though he'd literally been caught bribing players not too long before the series, no action had been taken against him. Now, if that kind of corruption can be so open and you know, not have any consequences, then it would stand to reason that Chick Gandil and Eddie Seacott maybe could get in on the action as well. Since around mid-August, the pair had been talking about potentially making the World Series a lucrative event. not just for the two of them, but for other team members as well. While the team were in New York for one of the closing few games of the 1919 season, it's been alleged that Eddie Seacott and Chick Gandil met with two shady characters at the Ansonia Hotel in Manhattan. The men in question were Billy Maharg and Sleepy Bill Burns. Billy Maharg used to be a boxer before becoming a full-time gambler, and Bill Burns was a retired Major League pitcher who picked up the nickname Sleepy Bill on account of his laid-back playing style. In and around that time, in a separate meeting in Boston, Chick Gandil also met up with one of the biggest bookmakers in the US, Joseph Sports Sullivan. Sullivan also brought along with him a gambler from Des Moines, Iowa named David Zeltzer. Sullivan and Zeltzer didn't know that there'd been a separate meeting in New York, just as Billy Maharg and Bill Burns had no idea there was a meeting in Boston, which right now isn't important because it's quite a complicated story. What is important is that Seacott and Gandil had put the wheels into motion of a plan that would spiral completely out of control. The two sets of gamblers began contacting potential investors, and the news quickly spread throughout the underworld. At first, Burns and Maharg attempted to acquire the funds via connections in Philadelphia, but when that didn't work, they decided to approach a man with a hell of a lot more power, influence, and capital behind him. They pitched their idea to infamous gangster and kingpin Arnold Rothstein. But when Rothstein turned them down, they were rapidly running out of time. They needed somebody with connections. Which brings us right back to our old friend Hal Chase, a man with more connections than a telephone circuit board, who at the time was playing for the New York Giants. Chase was able to hook them up with a gambler by the name of Abe Attell. Attell was another former boxer turned criminal, and aside from being a gambler, he just so happened to work part-time as a bodyguard for Arnold Rothstein. Long story short, Attell was able to convince Rothstein to reconsider, and eventually he decided that he at least partially would finance their idea. But what Abe Attell didn't know was that Rothstein also decided to contribute financially to the rival scheme as well. The details of how Rothstein had two fixes at once are pretty complicated, but none of that really matters right now. What does matter is that both funnels of cash had the exact same goal, to ensure that the World Series for 1919 went to the Cincinnati Reds. And now we get to the fun part. Which players were in and which players were out. Fred McMullen, a third baseman from Kansas, was one of the first players recruited. And there are many fans and historians who still believe that McMullen was in on it from the very beginning. McMullen was closely followed by a shortstop from San Francisco named Charles August Risberg, aka Swede Risberg. Next up to join the fix was Oscar Happy Felsch, a center fielder from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Happy was coming off the back of one of the best seasons in his career. Throughout the 1919 season, he'd been solid both at bat and in the field, and once made 4 assists from the outfield in just one game, equaling a major league record at that time. A pitcher from Missouri named Claude Lefty Williams also wanted in, and like his fellow pitcher Eddie Seacott, Lefty's personal price to lose the series was $10,000. Including Gandil and Seacott, there were now 6 players in on the scam, leaving 2 more players still left to recruit. Which brings us to one of my favourite people in this whole story, a third baseman from Pottstown, Pennsylvania by the name of Buck Weaver. There's not too many photos of Weaver that I've found where he's not smiling. Just look at that face. Look at his face. Tell me he wouldn't be fun to hang out with. He seems to embody a real childlike spirit of fun and a genuine love for the game. But just like Ben Kingsley said earlier,
it's the sheer fuck-offness of it all, am I right?
And finally, we come to Joe Jackson, who never attended any meetings with the gamblers. He pretty much did it the exact opposite of Weaver. Weaver went to all the meetings and didn't accept a penny, and Joe Jackson went to none of the meetings, but did accept a payment, which we'll come to later. So, now we have the 8-man team who were willing to throw the most prestigious title in baseball. Next time, we'll talk about the actual games, what happened behind the scenes in further meetings with the gamblers, and generally just how the whole thing went down. Thanks for watching Loose Cannon TV. See you next time.